80s D&D players, what was your experience playing in the strange era of RPGs equals demon worship? Any crazy stories? We would play in the basement of a huge train depot. There were homeless people there that used to hang out and watch. Funniest story was when the cops came to raid the place. They were looking for someone in particular but he wasn't there. When they found the four of us sitting at an old table on milk crates with candles and flashlights surrounded by some of the local homeless people, they kind of freaked. We explained that we were just playing Dungeons and Dragons and the homeless people were cheering us on. They told us to be careful and left. I played with a kid who had to keep it a secret because his mom didn't want him to play, didn't own any of the books or anything, and kept his character sheet at my house. Mostly, the kids I played with were college professors' kids, so they didn't believe any of that crap. The worst thing that ever happened is one of us created a female paladin named Imogadesimbd and we giggled whenever someone said her name. And then we all remained virgins until after high school. We used to play MTG at my friend's house. We had to call Wrath of God Wrath of Bob in case his mom heard through the door. I asked a buddy to play, who asked his mom. She said no because we would summon demons. He told me this. It had never occurred to me. So we tried. Nothing happened. I told him to tell his mom that we tried but it's not real. He moved like a week later. I found out years later. Not because of me. Good effort, at least. Two of my friends were told they could not associate me anymore due to my satanic beliefs. One of them was Pentecostal and spoke in tongues every weekend. Hey, I didn't shun you just because you like to get possessed and act like Linda Blair all the time. I'm an 80s baby and started playing D&D in the early 90s. My friend's mom thought it'd be awesome to help us learn math and social skills, so once a week she'd run little light-hearted adventures for us. She even make little wooden swords and shields based off of our characters we played, so we had life-sized examples on how big and heavy weapons were. My dad knew and he was okay with it and thought it was a great idea to get us to study history and such. My mom is a devout Catholic and he didn't tell her out of fear of what she'd do. She finally found out about 6 or 7 months into the game sessions. I remember we were playing and she showed up at the house and very angrily asked the DM mom to step outside. They then proceeded to scream about God, faith, math, innocence and fantasy. My mom took me out and I wasn't allowed over there anymore, but her son could hang out at our house. What she never knew was he smuggled over a bunch of books his mom bought me. I still have them to this day and I've been a D&D player since. I still hold games every week and don't regret anything. I hope I grow up to be cool D&D dad, teaching my kids friends about math, social skills and fantasy. Most likely I'll be lame D&D dad who scares away my kids' friends and force my kids to play with me when all they want to do is go outside and play sports. Old fart reporting in. Started playing in 1979 before school with some fellow speech and debate geeks and a couple other kids. Towards the end of the year, we brought our stuff into the actual S&D classroom. We had a speech and debate team, which was extracurricular, and also an elective class, which really only consisted of people on the team. As an educator now, not sure how this was kosher, but I digress. Our teacher coach became very interested in D&D and would hang out in the back of the room with us when she was supposed to be critiquing kids on their pieces for the next tournament. We rolled her up a character, and she chose a chaotic evil magic user. Within a few days, one of the kids in class reported what was going on to their Pentecostal parents, and our game was shut down due to satanic worship on school grounds. Probably didn't help when our teacher declared after a fight with town guards, "I rip the heart from the guard's chest and eat it." Our teacher was really into her character. I never really played D&D, but I did play a lot of Hero Quest and Battlemaster. My dad was into it, but my mom went really religious and hated it. When they divorced, my HQ and BM games vanished. I was getting decent at drawing too. I would draw these fantastic scenes of ruins and wizards with lightning, really badass 80s crap. One day I come home from school to see my mom with a metal trash can in the driveway. She had me put all my drawings, my sketchbooks, my pencils, pens, and charcoals into the bin, and she lit it on fire. Burned everything I had created. Losing the drawings was painful as heck, but the thing that really destroyed me was a notebook I had designed my very own RPG in. It had over maps, Random encounters. Dungeons with flaws. I would have a player play it and I would kind of DM the game. Roll the encounters and enemy rolls. Voice the NPCs, etc. All that went into the fire. I stopped drawing that day. Now I can't draw for crap. I've tried to recapture the ability but I don't have the muscle control. Done countless exercises. Mom is a mess. I still have massive issues with her. I have a ton of stories. Bonus quick story. I found metal music thanks to Hell's Bells Christian anti-rock and roll propaganda movie. I'm sorry but your mother was a total B for doing that. I started playing D&D in the early 80s, when it was fairly new. Over the years, I played dozens of different RPGs, but the original D&D has a special place in my heart. As far as the demon summoning angle, I remember when it started to become a big deal. My mom was a teacher and she went to a seminar on D&D and devil worship. When the lady giving the seminar starting explaining the dangers of playing, my mom called her out on it. She told her that her kids play, all their friends play, and we are all smart, well-adjusted kids with good grades. Given that the lady giving the seminar hadn't even met anyone who had ever played the game, my mom basically dropped the mic on her. I never did summon a demon, but I did once have a dragon punch me. I once had a black dragon acid my level 0 warrior to death, right before the potion wore off and it turned back into a kobold. Thanks dad. I had obliquely mentioned it to my youth minister. I think I was 11 or 12, 6th grade I guess. He went from a nice guy to talk to super serious, super determined to convince me that pretending to believe in spells and such was no different than actually believing it, that witchcraft was indeed real, and that Satan worshippers used this kind of information in their ceremonies and sacrificial rituals. I tried laughing it off. He wouldn't let it drop. I tried timidly disagreeing with him. He wouldn't let it drop. I tried agreeing on some points. He wouldn't have it. There was this strange passion against it. It seemed like it came out of nowhere, and I thought I knew the guy pretty well. But in my mind, I knew it was all bulls. I couldn't believe that as a kid. I was already smarter than this learned, respected adult. Of course it was no different than pretending a skinny tree branch was a lightsaber in my backyard. Of course it was no different than Santa or the Easter Bunny or what have you. I don't think that this gave me religious doubts per se, but it did make me think that I could make smarter decisions for myself than just taking an adult teacher or authority figure's word on it. When I started playing Magic TG in middle school, my mom went to talk to our pastor about it. He laughed and told her that it's just a game. Oh yeah, right around when I first started with the old red basic D&D set, my family's GP retired and the new quack who took over his practice spent about 3/4 of my physical trying to talk me into recognizing the danger to my soul that the game represented. He also misdiagnosed me as having anemia despite lacking any symptoms, same as my mom and great aunt, which I quickly figured out was part of his racket to prescribe unnecessary vitamin shots. I insisted on going back to my pediatrician for a second opinion and stuck with him as my doctor until adulthood. We later found out that quack doctor got arrested for diddling teenage boys, so I have a sneaking suspicion his concern about my spiritual well-being may not have been genuine. If my grandma read this, she'd somehow put together that playing D&D leads to child diddling. I love her but sometimes. D&D was never the problem, oddly. I was maybe around 10 years when I came home all excited and chatting up this really cool game that my best friend's cousin let us play. My mom basically just asked to look at the character sheet for my dwarf I'd made, asked me a bunch of questions about how you play, how characters are made. I think I remember her interested in character alignment and deities, which I thought was maybe the only boring part of the game. She seemed to think it was overall pretty harmless, at least from us kids' perspectives. She even helped me type up blank character sheets on our electronic word processor typewriter and photocopy a bunch of them. About a week later, my mom surprised me with the red beginner box set and the blue expert box set, plus a set of dice. It was awesome. I guess she figured that the worst that would happen was I gonna be a dork. I was already a die-hard 10-year Star Wars expert, so the Rubicon was crossed. There was never an issue with D&D after my mom sat down and looked everything over and asked questions instead of just buying into the hysteria. It's sort of surprising really. Iron Maiden was my favorite band at the time, but my mom was convinced they made devil worship music, so I wasn't allowed any of their albums, nor any IM posters that featured Eddie on them, only posters of the band members themselves. My best friend used to bootleg copy the album's cassette tapes for me and write crap like Richard Marx and Air Supply on the label, and other lame crap so that I knew which album was which. In middle school, early 90s, my best friend and I were playing a homemade version of the Fasserit system based on Bloods and Crips gangs. Satan was basically old news, and Dr. Dre's The Chronic, and Ice-T's Cop Killer, and Cypress Hill were the thing that was scaring the living crap out of parents now. My best friend was in my room and we were playing and my mom burst into the room and just flipped the frick out. She didn't even enter then flip her crap. She burst in with her crap already flipped. The only thing my friend and I later determined was that she must have been listening through the door. She came in screaming and fricked up our maps and tokens and dice. She grabbed all of our characters' sheets and notes and papers and tore them up into little prices and left the room hollering about how that game wasn't going to be played under her roof. She's not gonna have us becoming a bunch of dang gangbangers. Me and my friend just looked at each other like, what the frick? I lived in Montana. Everyone around us was dumb fricking hicks and cowboys. Where the frick was I gonna find a gang to join anywhere in the whole state, let alone one that didn't laugh my white butt back to my middle class suburbs? It was ridiculous. More nuts than Iron Maiden making devil music. I remember looking at my friend and just saying, my mom's fricking insane. She burst in with her crap already flipped. Favorite line today. In the late 80s, I was in high school, and a group of us who were playing taught a younger kid who lived in the neighborhood. He bought some dice, at least one rulebook, and a few miniatures. Several months later his mom flipped out and made him burn. Yes, literally burn. All of it. Some time later, his mom gave a video to my mother. They were friends, about how D&D was satanic. She got mildly worried and made me watch it with her. I laughed and laughed at how ridiculous the video was. While I was making fun of it, she calmed down and stopped the video. I'm gonna throw this one out there because it's kinda funny. So, I was introduced to D&D by way of my friends that played Magic: The Gathering back when it first came out, 1993 to 1994. They were all more than a little weird, but the good kind of weird, so I thought I'd join in. As I was getting to know the group, there was a kid, friend of a friend, who was totally unhinged. This kid was a few years older than us, probably 14 at the time, and totally believed he was his character. I'm not talking the method actors we all know and love, but this kid legitimately believed he was a dark elf ranger who could sense danger and had a fairy companion. The few times he showed up to hang out with us while playing MTG were an experience. Usually he'd stick around a few minutes, then whisper "I sense danger," and disappear for a few hours and come back looking like he'd been wandering a briar patch the whole time, covered in leaves and scratches. The stories my friends would tell about his antics scared me shitless, and I assumed it was the D&D that had sent him over the edge. I never really got an explanation as to why he'd never gotten help, but I think his parents were the type that believed in past lives and that kind of stuff. So maybe they were just okay with it. I ended up moving to another a few months after meeting this kid, but I always thought that it was the D&D that fricked the kid up. A few years later, my brother was introduced to the Star Wars RPG by one of his friends. 2E R&D published by West End Games, for those who care, and I was totally against him doing it. I told him about this mental case and tried to scare him away from starting to play. My dad told me to chill the frick out, to let my brother decide for himself, and maybe to give it a whirl myself. Well, I did, and that was that. 20 years later, I'm still RPGing. Funny note, I later found out that my dad was a registered DM and had at least one retired 20th level character, what he describes as a wizard dragon friend, that had actually been verified by TSR, and the bee he married made him throw it all away and give it up right before I was born. Ironically, I wasn't allowed to own any magic card until I was in college due to the same psychopathic bee thinking they were tarot cards. TLDR. I was the one convinced it was gonna ruin my brother, and my dad is a bigger nerd than I ever thought possible. My dad played D&D in the 80s. His parents were divorced and his mom had bought him the set that he and his friends used, and his dad and stepmom were very religious. So after visiting his mom one time, he showed up back at his dad's house to discover that his D&D set and records were all missing. He asked his stepmom about it and she told him that she and his dad had taken all of it and burned it. Big fight ensues. He goes to live with his grandparents, and he still has a bit of resentment towards them. I think they finally apologized when he was like 40ish. Congratulations, father and stepmother. You found a way to ensure your child resents you. I was raised Pentecostal and started playing in '92 when I was about 14. This was a bit after the 80s Satanism craze had fizzled out in the mainstream media, but that sort of hype still had my family in the mortal terror. My parents still believe that demonically possessed musicians employ backmasking to entice children into the army of Satan. We grew up reading Dark Dungeons without irony, going to see Mike Wonky preach to a packed stadium, and watching evangelists cast demons cast from people. At that point in my life, I bought into it almost completely, but not enough to keep me from dabbling in the dark arts of the dice. Nothing really climactic happened, but eventually my mom did find out and immediately called our pastor for an intervention. She threatened to burn all my books. I only saved them by telling her that they belonged to someone else, and from then on I had to hide them. My brother, who lived with my father, had it a little rougher, and I'm pretty sure he did actually watch his books burn. I guess my pastor had more important demons to battle than mine, because I never actually met with him about it. It was always a threat, though, and for a long time I had to periodically promise to my mother that I had stopped playing and had asked God for forgiveness. I never really felt like I did anything wrong, until many years later. I'm more than a little ashamed to admit that I did play a session of 4th edition. There's no God powerful enough to forgive that. We would basically sit around a dining room table rolling characters for longer than we played for, then had heated arguments about rules and roles. Good times. LOL, that just sounds like everybody's first time if you play in a group with no experience. Still a fun time. 80s crap. I had to deal with that in the 2000s when I was in high school. My godmother was absolutely horrified when I told her I wanted to go to a friend's house to play D&D. Asked her why. She was convinced I was on my way to an orgy. As if D&D ever led to an orgy. Obligatory not an 80s player, but when I first got into the game, in early high school, my dad, a Christian missionary, was one of those people who thought Pokemon and Harry Potter were gateways to devil worship. The first time I played, I mentioned to my dad that I'd watched some friends play, since that was kind of my litmus test for if something was of the devil. I got a lecture on how the game was evil and it led to devil worship and to suicide. So I played in secret for a few weeks before the game fell apart. No huge drama. The weird part was a few years later, after I came back from my first semester of college, I mentioned I had ran a game because frick you dad, I do what I want. He thought it was cool and said something along the lines of, "Did you know in the 80s people thought this game was demonic? Ha!" And then we played a family game over Christmas break. Weirdest crap ever. Pokemon is Chinese demons, and by evolving them you give these demons more power over your soul. Whenever this was mentioned it was met with ill-concealed laughter. Normally it was people mentioning it in passing and by strangers. None of my friends was told that they couldn't play. Devil worship. Whatever. Wanna see my dice collection? I got it in this sweet Crown Royal bag. I still have my dice in a Crown Royal bag. I started playing in college in 2004-ish. I grew up in Oklahoma City, the buckle of the Bible Belt. Back in the 70s and 80s, one of the regular places my friends and I played D&D was in a prayer room of the local Southern Baptist church. Preacher knew what was up and thought it was neat game, but never played. I never, ever, once heard a sermon about the evils of D&D from him or the preacher at the Bethany First Church of the Nazarene where my friend's family attended. The kid who introduced me to it in middle school became born again and stopped coming around before I even got a chance to play the character he helped me roll. I got all of his books out of the deal, since they were apparently evil now. I could see his point. It was Dragonlance and Kendo were revolting little Hobbit ripoffs. Didn't get a chance to play a game for another few years. When I was 13, a classmate committed suicide. Cause was Dungeons and Dragons, not the sexual assault by mother's boyfriend. Well, some of our D&D games were once held in church function rooms and libraries. Just to tell you how it all suddenly reversed. I blame the whole moral majority movement pushed by Pat Robertson, Oral Roberts, President Reagan, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, and the like. Most were televangelists, most who all eventually ended up being part of some sex or money scandal. D&D was not the top of their list, but it certainly affected us gamers. Our local Crown Books chain used to carry D&D in supplements, but eventually were pressured to stop. Before that happened, I was accosted by some woman who said I was into devil worship. I couldn't think of what to say, so I said it was probably too late, so I was going to have fun while I was still alive. She didn't take that well at all, and asked where my parents were. I told her at home. She made a comment about me being alone at my age, leading to me being a stray, and I said I was 15 and already had a job. I had yet to learn some people don't like being corrected. One of our friends who had rich parents had nearly everything D&D imaginable. Then his parents decided D&D was devil magic, burned all his books, and he wasn't allowed to play with us anymore. I recall being mortally offended that they chose to burn the books instead of give them away. Heck, a lot of TV talk shows would have an episode of D&D, and usually the set they had was all candlelit with people working in dark rooms, speaking in mumbling tones. The video camera would tilt back and forth, slowly fading from shot to shot, like what they thought an acid trip must look like. None of us player were like that at all. We needed bright lighting to read that dang small font ESR often used in modules. I don't know any gaming group that used dramatic lighting. I would have laughed at any that did. Oh god, the story about James Egbert would not stop getting airplay. I was so sick of that story. That and Mazes and Monsters. It was the only two things the media had, really, and they milked that cowbone dry. I did press relations with a science fiction convention back then, and one reporter described our game room, a function room with gamers pretty much anyone has seen in every con ever, as a backroom den filled with smoke and gambling. What smoke? We weren't allowed to smoke in hotels. That reporter already had an agenda, and that was a lesson learned on my part. Lucky for me, they spelled my name wrong in the paper, too, so anyone looking for me would have a time finding me out. The biggest thing that upset me were people would make all kinds of comments about devil worship without opening one book or attending one game. But these people also did that with everything. I don't have to read or understand anything to dislike it and declare it harmful for humanity. A friend of mine's mom was convinced that D&D was satanic, demonic, whatever. In an attempt to scare my friend away from playing, the mom related a story to them of how the parents of a mutual friend of their family had thrown their child's D&D books into the fireplace and how they all heard the demons in the pages scream as the books burnt up. Friend's response was to keep playing. Mostly we had to deal with these terrible made-for-TV movies that treated Dungeons and Dragons like a precursor for murder. Monsters and Mazes starring Tom Hanks. My mom flipped and threw out all my first edition D&D manuals and modules after seeing that piece of crap movie. Luckily, my dad wasn't nuts, told her that was bulls and replaced my books. I started playing in the late 80s, in full swing of the satanic panic going on around D&D. My parents were awesome and never gave me any crap about it. I have an older brother who was a big troublemaker, so they were just happy I wasn't being arrested. But I had acquaintances at school who were dongs about it and would ask me bluntly if I worshipped the devil. Yeah, dumbass. I worship the devil and I wear a cross, right side up, around my neck. And my youth minister was a huge dong about it. I was Methodist, so not a church you hear of and think those guys are backwards dickheads, but he gave me crap about D&D and also listening to metal. Is it any wonder I lost my faith? I still play, and my husband plays. Oh, and that troublemaker brother? He's a born-again Christian fundamentalist who thinks D&D and Harry Potter are literally witchcraft. I just can't freaking win. This isn't an experience from the 80s. In fact, it's from only about 5-8 years ago. I had been playing D&D for a few years and all my parents really knew about it was that it wasn't a video game, and I was a friend's house, not getting up to trouble. That was it, they were happy. My mom joined a Bible study group with some of the ladies from her church, and at some point during a study session, one of the ladies brought up her 2 boys being bored during the summer and getting up to no good. Well, my mom chimed in with that guy Dave 89 plays D&D with his friends and really seems to enjoy it. Plus it keeps it out of trouble. Apparently the looks of shock among some of the ladies was quite the sight to see. They began to lecture her about how I was bringing Satan into my life and how the D&D rulebooks are on the level of satanic texts. She came home and told me this. I chuckled, handed her the 4th edition handbook and a few of the other books, and after about 5 minutes of skimming, she came to the conclusion that the ladies were clearly overreacting and that it was so complicated. She was happy I was using my brain instead of smoking it away. So yay. This was in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and that demon worship misnomer is still alive and well. Playing 4th edition isn't a sin, it's punishment for your sins. I knew the bad press was there, but it didn't really affect me. I started playing around late 81, joined a real gaming group in mid 1982. The kid whose house we played at was from a very religious family, and they didn't have a problem with the game. The messes we left behind. On the other hand, the only negative feedback I got was when I moved to a new town in a new state in 1983. I met a few kids, had no idea who was into what. Kind of threw D&D out in casual conversation in front of the mother of one of the neighborhood kids, and she said yes, we've heard about that game. Made it clear she didn't approve. Didn't really matter. Her kid wasn't going to play it anyway. Not his thing. The horror stories were out there, and I was aware of them, and I'm sure lots of people had different experiences, but it really didn't get to me much. Christmas of 89. We went to my grandma's house with that side of the family. My odd, but nice, cousin who taught me all about the space shuttle and gave me a copy of The Hobbit got his own copy of the AD&D 2E manual. One of the aunts flipped her crap and told him he needed to burn that book in the fireplace right now. She continued to tell us all the ways that he could summon demons, cast spells, etc. from this book. He got very sad and upset, but most of the family just laughed at her, since she was already the crappy aunt who brought the warm deviled eggs and cheap Kool-Aid. I got really mad at my mother, who had explained to me on the ride over that I could not, in fact, grow up to be a ghostbuster. Somebody was lying. Explained to me on the ride over that I could not, in fact, grow up to be a ghostbuster. Yep, 80s kid confirmed. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.